how many of you are aware of what accessibility is? I am expecting the audience is aware about what accessibility is. Why do we need accessibility and all? So this talk is not going to be about what and why of accessibility. It's just one step ahead of it, saying that how we can incorporate the accessibility checks at the unit level, unit testing level. And that is the whole talk all about, which is accessibility aware unit testing or unit testing accessibility. So let's consider that you're building a, a public facing application, correct? A web app. Uh, and it is going to get used globally as well. So according to one of the data, there is a 15% world population which has some sort of disabilities, correct? And that is why you need your applications to be accessible for those people to use your application, correct? And imagine that you have a typical, like a particular application which will get used by a small set of percentage as well. But even that percentage, if you comes down to numbers, will be huge. And now think about a criteria or scenario that you're supposed to go live, correct? Let's say next week. And what I've seen in my career is that usually there is a third party company who do the accessibility checks. You provide them the application and say that now check for all the accessibility things. Okay. Now you're supposed to go live next week. Suddenly you get like a bunch of accessibility is issue in a report, correct? And you're stuck, correct? Should I go live or should I have to fix all those issues now or not? In both the cases, correct? If you go live, that means that that percentage of users cannot use your website or application, correct? Or if you don't go live, that means your go live date is pushed. So go to market is pushed. In both the cases, if I'm a product person or if I'm building product from which I'm expected to earn money, correct? At the end of the day, why you build money, build a product, correct? You are supposed to get money out of it. You lose money because either you lose your users or you lose your time. Now that is the whole crux of this talk, which says that many screens that you should shift left your accessibility. I hope most of you would have heard the term shift left security, shift left testing. This talk is more about shift left your accessibility as well. And what does shift left means is that in your software development life cycle, correct? You don't need to wait till the end you are going to go live to check for few things, correct? You don't test your application in the later stages of STLC. You don't check for security in the later stages of accessibility. And that applies to all the different NFRs as well. NFRs like non-functional requirements, correct? Performance. If your performance is not optimum, you cannot go live. And if you keep that check for the later stages, again, you cannot go live because you are going to lose your users. In similar way, we should do the same thing, saying that shift left your accessibility means add your accessibility checks in the initial phases of your SDLC itself, rather than doing it in the end and getting stuck to go to market. Now, I'm kind of not a slide person. I'm a developer, hardcore developer. So I'll not have more slides than three more, four. So I'll show you some code how to do that. Okay, how to shift left your accessibility, how to incorporate accessibility in the unit test level, and talk more about the code and all. So what we are gonna do is I have an app built. I'll demonstrate that app. I will talk about accessibility issues in that and how we will solve that in the unit level. A quick question before that. How many of you use React here? Almost everyone, correct? That's I think all the front-end engineers nowadays use most of the times React only. How many of you do unit testing in React? You do. Good. How many of you use RTL, React Testing Library? How many of you use test IDs in RTL? So just to let you know, unit testing. I hope you know the word term unit testing. So I'm not going to detail that out. RTL is React testing library. So when you have a, let's say you have a React component, correct? And you want to test that at the unit level, at the lowest level of your test pyramid, correct? You need to get hold of your component that you have built. For example, if I'm saying that if I need to add some value to an input and submit the form, these are the values being sent to the server. That's kind of a unit test. Now, how do you input value that to that input box? You need to get hold of that DOM element. And RTL, React Testing Library, helps you get that. There was a library in the past, usually market of that library has reduced a lot, called Enzyme. Now everyone has moved, most of the teams have moved to RTL, React Testing Library. Now the problem with RTL and a lot of people writing tests for that is that a lot of times we use test IDs. Now, what is test ID? I'll explain that by going through the code. This code is more about why you should not use test IDs and use accessibility checks at the unit level or use accessibility rules at the unit level. Okay. So I'll show you the code now. So this is a very small application that I've built. If you see the left side of it, it's an inaccessible app, okay? And the right side of it is an accessible app. Now, what is inaccessible? In very common accessibility way, if you have a form, correct? If you have an input with a label, when you click on a label, your input should get focused. And that is done by HTML4 element and value. Similarly, here, correct? But if you see in the accessible app, if I'm clicking here, it is getting focused. Very basic checks. I'm not going into the depth of accessibility, hardcore checks and all, very basics. Both of these apps looks exactly similar, correct? You cannot identify that the left one is not accessible. This submit, correct? If I like run the app as well, Vishal, my surname is Sharma. If I say submit, it just say that welcome to export of Vishal Sharma. That's all. And the right hand side is also doing this exact same thing. When I click on the submit, correct? That submit is not a button. It's a div. And that is also accessibility failure. You should not do that. Right hand side, it's a div. It's a button. So it's a properly managed accessible elements in the right hand side of it. Now, how many of you use screen readers for accessibility checks? Again, something new you will learn, I'll say. So I'm just enabling screen reader.
Voiceover on Chrome.
Are you
White plus
able?
React Google Chrome Vishal equal experts window. White plus React web content has keyboard focus.
You're all able
You
to
are
hear
currently on web
whatever
content.
is
To enter the
screen
web
reader.
area, press Control Option edit text blank. You are currently on a
So it
text
says
field
edit
inside web
text
content.
blank.
To enter text in this field, type to edit text blank. You are currently on a edit text black reset button. You are currently on a button inside web content. To click this voiceover off.
Turn it off. So if you see from the screen reader perspective, now screen reader is used by in people with some disabilities, people who use keyboards to a larger extent. Like they cannot use mouse, or people have some visual impairments, correct? So they have to rely on what voiceover is telling you, what kind of field is it. So if you had noticed when I focused on the inaccessible app first name, it just told you that it's a added text. It's a text box. That's all. But it is not telling you what I'm supposed to fill in. Similarly, when I focus, the submit button didn't get focused. So as a user with again some disabilities, I didn't get to submit the form as well, because just to style my app, I make a button I make a div look like a button. Now just hear out how the accessible app, so how screen reader here, like read out the accessible part of the application. Okay.
Voiceover on first name edit text. You are currently on a text field. Inside last name, edit text. You are submit button. You are current reset button. You are currently on a button inside web content. To click this button, voiceover off.
So you would have noticed the change, correct? My focus screen reader is able to tell you that it's a first name that I'm expecting you to input. It's a last name I'm expecting you to input, and it's a submit button. And if you click or if you press enter, this will submit your form. Okay. Now, quickly going to the code, how it is being written. Very basic React component, nothing fancy here. In inaccessible side of it, okay, you will see that label and inputs are not tied together. There is no HTML4, there is no ID, there's not linked together, correct? That is why my screen reader is not able to read that out. That is a very basic accessibility check. Any tool will tell you that this is a problem. Similarly, the last name doesn't have that ID or HTML4 element. And as I mentioned, correct, this is not a button, this is a div. Now moving to the accessible form, this has an HTML4 attribute, which is pointing to a input ID. Correct? That is how the screen reader is able to hear that out, that this is a first name edit text. And this is a submit button, which has a name called submit. Everyone with me here? No confusion, very simple thing. Now we are going to run tests. So both of these inaccessible part and the accessible part has unit test written to. If you see the code structure, correct? Form input test under accessible directory, and there's a form input test for the inaccessible part of it as well. So if I run test for everything, correct? Everything is running fine, correct? No test is breaking. For inaccessible as well, it is working. For accessible as well, it is working. And if I go through the test once, both tests are actually checking the same thing, saying that it welcomes the user after submitting the form. For both the sites, accessible, inaccessible. So I'm able to write test for even if my app is inaccessible, correct? And it is testing the whole functionality as well. Like I'm saying, when I enter the value and input last name, submit the button, this is what I'm expecting. If you read out the test, simply saying, this is the first name, I change it, I add this value, I got hold of last name, I add this value. When I submit, click on the submit button, I'm expecting to screen to show me the welcome to expert of Harry Potter. Very basic text. Now the difference lies is how are we actually getting hold of that element. And if you see, this is by test ID here, not via accessibility role. Okay. Here I am saying it, get by test ID first name, and my code is also saying that the input, correct, has a data test ID first name. So if I change it, let's just for the sake of like failing the test, if I change it, my test is failing. Just let me full screen. So my test starts failing, saying that I am unable to find an element with this particular ID because I just failed it for the sake of failing. But now let's say that instead of a div, correct? Again, I'm playing it around just to tell you the problem here. I change div to a paragraph here. Again, look and feel will remain same. Now my button is a paragraph actually. My tests are not failing. I didn't save it. First name. Yeah. So nothing breaks. Tests are still passing for me. So my unit testing is not checking for accessibility here. Correct? It's via test IDs, which is an anti-pattern in case of RTA. Now let's go to the tests of an accessible part of that app. Now, instead of using any test ID, correct, I'm trying to get the hold of that element with the actual accessibility checks. For example, I'm saying get by label text. Because my label and input are bind together, I can get hold of that input via label text. That is accessibility. I'm saying get the element by label text first name. I'll talk about that user.type later. So you can ignore that part for now. Get by label text last name. Now submit button says get by role. And that role is your accessible role. Your like standard HTML standard accessible role for a button is a button. And that is why my screen reader were also saying that it's a submit button. And I'm saying that get a hold of that button via name submit. That's your ARIA label or accessible name of that button. When I click on it, I'm expecting screen to get by role heading. Again, heading is a role and is a standard HTML role. Level 4. This is again something a user is able to see, correct? It's a level 4 heading for me. So I'm saying that I'm testing that markup as well by role. And I'm expecting that text content to have welcome to React Conf Harry Potter again. But now, if I try to change anything in my code, let's say that I change HTML4, which is again tied to my ID, and give it any other value, just random value. My test fails. And read the failure here. It is saying that I am unable to find a label with the text of first name. However, no form control was found associated with that label. That is my HTML4 and IDs are tied together because of like for accessibility, correct? Now my test has started failing, saying that you're not writing it out in an accessible way, so I'm breaking it for you. That's an accessibility check. That's an accessibility check at the unit level because my test failed. Similarly, I'll just fix that part. Similarly, now if I change the name of my submit button, okay, saying that say submit form, my test fails again. Previously with test IDs, nothing will fail because I don't care about whatever is the name of that button, correct? Here it actually fails saying that unable to find an accessible element with the role button and a name submit because the name of that button is changed to submit form now. Again, let's say just for the sake of doing it again, I changed button to a div. My test is failing. Saying the same thing, I am not able to find an element with the role button because that role is no more there. Default button accessible role is a button. And again, a name submit. So my unit tests are failing because my accessible checks are changing. And that is what the unit level testing of accessibility is at a very core, very basic level. Again, I'm not talking about very like complex elements here, a very basic form input and submit just to tell you the idea what it is able to do that. Now, if you go to the official docs of RTL as well, you will see that these are the official docs actually also talks about how to get hold of an element uh, via accessibility roles, via your label text, via if that particular radio button is selected or not, is it checked or not, and so on. It will actually talk about get by text ID, test ID in the end because they don't want you to use it. Sometimes you have to because where the accessibility doesn't matter. Because if I have to check if a style change on a div, there's no other way but saying that get that hold of that div by test ID and check if there is a style applied to it because that style changed according to my interactivity. Sometimes you have to, which where accessibility might not matter. But the crux again is to use accessible rules to find the element in your test. So now moving on. Any questions still now? Okay. So let me just pass the test again. How much time is it? Okay. I'm just going slow. Now, similar to the app that we just saw, there's an extension of that app to talk about a little more complex element. So I'm quickly changing that to show that. Now, the only change in this app is you have one more field called gender. Usual form, correct? Name, first name, last name, and gender. That gender is a drop down, male, female, others. In both the sides, again, it behaves exactly the same, but left side is not accessible. Now, what is not accessible? We'll check that via screen reader again.
Voiceover on edit text, blank, button. You are currently on a button inside web content. To click this voiceover off.
It just told you that it's a button, but it's a drop down. It has options tied to it. The screen reader is not telling you. Now imagine somebody who's not able to see your application, correct? They have to rely on what they are hearing. They don't know this is a drop down. Now again on the right hand side.
Voice first name, edit, last name, edit text, select gender, list box pop up, menu pop up combo box. You are currently on a menu pop up combo box. Male not selected, 1 of 3, completion selected. You are female not selected, 2 of 3, others not selected, 3 of male not selected, 1 of 3, completion selected. You are currently on web content. To enter voiceover off.
You must have noticed the change here, correct? Now, by default, when I clicked on that drop down, my 3 of the options is like visible there. By default, the first option is selected. And the screen reader is able to tell a user saying that it has a first option. It has 3 options, out of which first is male and it is not selected. There's a second option, female, which is not selected. So I'm able to understand how my app is behaving here, correct? And that is accessibility. It's not perfectly accessible app, but I'm just telling you the idea how it works. Okay, there are so many interactions that you have to add it to make more accessible. This is very basic again. Now looking at the tests again. So inaccessible part, this is the drop down where I'm saying that there's a button. When you click it, it will just open that drop down and it is being managed by a React state. Don't go by my code. I didn't want to loop it through. I wanted to show you explicitly that there are 3 options and what should happen on click of each option. The test of it, again, if you notice, there is a data test ID. And my test is again saying that there is a gender list. You will click on by test ID. And once this list gets opened, you read it by test ID saying this is gender male and click on it. And in the end, if you see in the test, it will just change that there is a title attached to a gender. I'm saying that whenever you select male, it's a Mr. Female, it is Miss, and others is MX. So my test is say, oh, if I've clicked on male, it's Mr. Harry Potter. So both the tests are again working, correct, with inaccessible way as well. But if you see the accessible dropdown, correct, there's so many options attached to it now. ARIA. I'm not going to go in details of what ARIA is. But if you see, I'm saying that this button has a role called combo box. That is why the screen reader was able to tell you that this is a button, which is a combo box and it has options attached to it. This has pop-up again. Screen reader told us that it has pop-up. ARIA controls, which is tied to ID because it is interacting with each other. If I click on it, only then the the drop down is getting selected, expanded, true and false, and so on. Now there is no test ID attached to it. If you see in the UL as well, in the button as well, no test ID. And in the test, you will see that I'm getting hold of that element via firstly get by role because I'm attaching a role called combo box to it. And the name is selected gender. When I click on it, I'm again selecting by role the options ULLI with a name mail and then submitting it. Now, let's say if I change it, saying that I don't care about name, I'm just adding just some random name here. My test fails, saying that unable to find the accessible element with role option and the name mail one to one. Again, accessibility is getting checked at the unit level. Another good thing about this is that if the test fails, correct, it will tell you that in in that screen, because RTL says try to find everything via screen. These are the list of accessible roles available. Like if you see, here are the accessible roles. There's a text box, which is first name, last name. There's a combo box. It will, it is gonna tell you upfront that you're not trying to find out something which I know is here. So that is why I'm failing to get that element. And that is again what accessibility check at the unit level is. I quickly fix it and my tests are passing. Okay. So now the same principle applies to any component that you build. So the reason I demoed the drop down part of it is that you create those components manually, correct? I have to add a button, add a ULLI saying that, or and opening ULLI just on the click of button. So it's kind of a molecule, correct? Not an atom like an input. So you will create drawers, you will create model pop-ups. All of these rely on the same principle, correct? You have to attach a accessible role to it so that screen reader understands that you are trying to open a model pop-up when you click on this particular button. And when model pop-up opens up, this has this information. And you can test everything at the unit level. You don't need to say that my model pop-up has a test ID. No. You can say that there's a there's an element with this particular role, and that is a model or a pop-up. Cool. A quick another thing that RTL provides is that you can, instead of waiting for your test to fail and let you know that these are the available accessible roles, you can also use something called as a log roles, which is coming from RTL again. So if I run the test, second, oh, I'm using get roles here. So it will tell you that these are the roles available for within that element, not on the screen because I'm passing it an element. And similarly, I can use log roles. So it will tell you the HTML element that this is available. So you can use that as well to figure out what are the roles available for the markup that I'm trying to test. All clear? Any questions? Okay.
Vishal, just one question. So, is there any way to get the feedbacks, like if we are missing some ARIA options to add on?
Uh, just wait for a second. The next section we'll talk a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the next part uh, that we are going to talk about is user events. So when you are looking at the test, correct? I asked you, we'll talk about what is user.type and versus fire event.change, correct? Now what happens is that when you're saying fire event.click, uh, it kind of dispatches a DOM event, correct? It doesn't actually check for how the actual user will interact with your application. If I go by theory, correct, I'll just read it out for you. User event is is a part of a testing library that simulates user interactions. By dispatching the events that would happen if the interactions took place in a browser, not as a custom event like Fire event do it for you. Now, fire event dispatches DOM events, whereas user event simulates full interaction. And one of the example is input box again, correct? So if you have to type anything in your input box, you will focus is first, correct? You will add some value to it. You will blur out of it. Now, user events is capable to figure out that these are the list of events that happened when I'm typing in an input. Fire event dot change will just say that, oh, I am changing anything in your input box. It doesn't care about anything else. Also, user events adds visibility and interactability checks as well. And I'll show you the example where user events actually came out as a surprise to me as well. Um, because again, it tries to check how the actual browser behaves with you. Okay. Now going back to the example, to the code again. In the accessible part of it, it is not typically an accessibility thing, but it helps you to write more accessible tests. So if you check this part, correct? I'm saying user dot click submit button, not fire event dot click. So the good thing is, let's say that because of any reason, again, this is just an example. I add a style to it saying that pointer event is none. It's a CSS property which will not allow user to click on the submit button in a layman's term. The pointer event will not work on it. Now, what should happen according to you? What should happen? Should the test fail or not? It should fail, correct? So right now I'm using user.click, okay? It fails. Read out the error. Error is saying unable to perform pointer interaction as the element has pointer event nonce. Now this library is intelligent enough to tell you that you are added a CSS property which is holding back user to click on it. Again, how the user is interacting with your application, accessibility, part of accessibility. But if I change this code on this test to say that instead of using user.click, use fire event, my test didn't fail. Okay, so fire event is not intelligent enough to like throw these kind of errors as well. So user event is much more handier than fire events. It's again a part of your React testing library. It's a kind of a sibling library to it, and it actually tells you to use this instead of fire events as well. So when you're writing tests, make it more accessible using user events rather than the fire events. Now, the last section of this talk is how do you write automated tests to check accessibility? Again, at unit level, you are saying that, oh, input on this input, click on the submit button. And via accessibility rules, you are able to find out any accessibility issues, correct? Now, there are libraries available in the market which actually throws you an error if your screen or your app is not accessible. You don't need to write a unit test to figure that out. And one of those library is that I am using here is called X. I'm using VTest as a test runner here. So VTest X is a library built on top of it. So if you're using Jest, correct? Jest X is also there. Now X is this is an npm node package X, but in general X is a tool. So this is a node version of that tool. There is Aqua as well, which does the same thing, and many more. Correct. I'm just using a library called X. Now to figure out all the default errors in your code, and this might answer your question as well, Jyoti. Not specifically to ARIA, but to test your application at a very basic level. If you see here, I'm just saying that render this particular component and expect to have no violations. Right now, my accessible app, correct, is accessible. So that's why all of my tests are passing. Now let's try to break this. Just reverting my code. So from with drop down, let's say that I remove again the HTML element. expected the HTML found at this to have no violations. But it also tells you that received form element must have a label. So this is coming via X telling you that this is a problem, accessibility problem in your code. You should check it and add the proper check to it. It will also tell you that what can be a fix of it as well. Okay, it's an automation, correct? You didn't write any test for this, just to check that it should not have a violation, no like feature test and figure out if it is accessible or not. Similarly, if I just tell you that uh, I'm removing this if check, okay, just to make that image available in the DOM. So if I remove alt, again something accessibility check. You should have alt attribute to every image. If I remove it, it says that this have no violations, but there are two violations. Images must have alternate text. Now this tool is telling you that these are the problems in your code, you should fix it. And it does more than that as well. For example, again, instead of just checking for basic things, it will also tell you that for ARIA things as well. For example, ARIA control must have a valid ID attached to it. If I don't attach a valid ID, this tool will tell you that this is a problem with it. And so on. You can set the guidelines to these tools as well, saying that I want to test my app for WCAG 2.1 or check for 2.2 or triple A or double A or A. You can tell them that what level of rules that I want to check my app against, and it will throw you errors accordingly. Again, automated way. You didn't write any feature test to figure out that your app is not accessible. It will tell you all the basic errors. Again, this was at the unit level while writing test. There are these tools provides you Chrome extensions also. So we lost it. No, okay. I added to a Chrome profile. Just give me a second. Huh. So Xdev tool, the same app. I'm just running it. Not this one. Scan. Huh. So just a Chrome extension, which I executed. This is a paid tool. I'm using free part of it. So if you are in a client application, you can get the license for it as well. But at a free level tier, I'm able to see those basic errors here. And these are the errors we talked about as well. Button must have a text. Images must have an alternative text. Form element must have a label because the left part of it, correct? It's an inaccessible app. You can also click on it and say that where the error is. It will tell you that this is an error. Most of these errors will be on the left-hand side. Right is inaccessible app. So this tool is telling you where the error lies and you should check for it as well. Any questions? All clear or all clear? Okay. So we are almost to the end of this. So we okay. So we talked about unit testing. We talked about few of the tools to check the textability as well. But there's a stat saying that these tools, correct? It actually checks for only 30% accessibility issues. Like though you are able to find out those issues, but there is a need of manual testing of accessibility as well. So you cannot just say that if I'm adding all those tools, my app is accessible. So you need more than that as well. So what you can do out of it, like for this, like one of the example is that these tools are not telling you that there is a color contrast issue. Correct? It's accessibility check. Like if you have white on top of white or a very light on a very light background, these tools are not going to tell you that. Maybe the paid versions will, But by default, my unit tests are not telling you. They are not going to tell you that for sure. That's not unit test is used for. So that means what else you can do to make your app more accessible? Include accessibility checks in your automation pipeline for sure. Correct. If you're writing tests, these should run in the your CI/CD pipelines so that it fails. One of those examples is like Lighthouse. We must all of you must be aware of Lighthouse, correct? So Lighthouse also checks for accessibility. So you can actually tell Lighthouse that this is my threshold of accessibility. If it goes like down, the score goes down of this my threshold, fail the build. Should do that. Uh, we talked about Chrome extension, correct? That will also kind of an automated way, but manual way. You should do manual testing. We did that with the X tool. We should do that. We should try to use the application via keyboard and figure out what issues that you are facing. So this makes a lot of difference, correct? When you're building a end user application, it might not make a big difference when you are building a for a very small set of users, correct? Because your client can tell you that I don't have this requirement. But for a public facing website, for a retail website where you know that it can be used by any set of people, you have to have these checks. So try to use your application via keyboard. Test your interface with assistive technologies. We just use screen reader, correct? That's an assistive technology. And Mac comes with a screen reader by default. There are other tools as well. NVIDIA has a tool. Your Windows machine has different tools for it. So check for that as well. And this is very important, the last line, and that has been my experience in the past that in such applications, correct, involve people with disabilities in testing. They will tell you more than what you cannot even figure out. In my previous project, correct, we had like we got to know that later that that person was not able was kind of a visually impaired person, and he was the actual accessibility checker for us, tester for us. And he was able to tell us that I'm not able to like use this section of that app. My X tool is giving me this. This is a list of errors that you are seeing in the app. So we should solve it. You can prioritize that with your stakeholders that we should fix it now. And with that, I'm done. A quick intro about me now. I'm a lead front-end engineer with more than 10 years of experience in building all the user interfaces and all. This is the profile that I have on LinkedIn, Medium, and GitHub. So I try to write mostly this talk. I try to write it down in the Medium account so you can follow that as well. And with that, that's all.